If you've ever heard people talk about the end times or Bible prophecy and felt like you couldn't quite get your bearings, this episode is for you. Maybe you just don't know the terms, or maybe you know the terms, but if you're being honest, they've started to blur together. In this episode, we're going to slow things down, set our bearings for studying eschatology, and clear out some of the clutter so that we're not just repeating what we've heard or following whatever camp we came from. We actually know what we're talking about. Filters off, let's break it down. All right, we're live. Hey, everybody. How's it going? I'm Kelvin, and you are watching Live Fire by Kelvin's Faith Unfiltered. If you will notice, I am absent my normal partner in crime who has the night off. So this is Live Fire. This is me and me alone. Today, we have decided that we are going to go over some of the basics in eschatology. So bear with me as I get some stuff set up, but we are going to have a good time tonight. So please make sure that if you have questions, that you put them in the chat. I do have a lovely assistant over here. Let me make sure my chat's working. Who will be watching that chat for me. Let me get this moved over here. And there we go. So feel free to say hi. But yeah, we are going to be going over the basics in eschatology. So what I really want to do is there is so much going on in the world today. And eschatology is starting to have a real impact. If you don't know, right, let's slow down. Eschatology, the study of end times or the end. And right now we have a lot of decisions that are actually being made all over the world that are being impacted by this. There are groups that are influencing very powerful people, and how they understand the Bible is starting to have an impact on that. So we want to understand this aright, and we want to get to know some of the terms tonight. It's not going to be a real heavy debate-driven type format tonight. It's going to be, let's get to the basics. And we want to understand the terms and where some things came from, because we have so much content that's going to be coming out over the next few weeks that's going to be based on that. So with that said, I really want to get to this. Let's see if I can do it. Yeah, I know that was a really nice little clumsy arm over there and cover my face, but hey, it's a one-man show here tonight. So eschatology basics. So we're going to go over some of these terms here and see if we can get ourselves calibrated to understand exactly what some of the views are and how it impacts how we read the Bible. So yeah, let's get started. So end times terms, that's where I want to start tonight. The first one is eschatology, which I kind of gave you that. You know, it comes from the Greek word eschatos, which is last or final, and logos, which that word should probably stick out to you. If you've ever saw somebody go through the John chapter 1, the Gospel of John, and they talk about the word or the logos, that's the word that they're using in there. And so that gives us the idea of last things, the study of last things. So that's what we're talking about, a period we often call the end times, or like I said, the formal term is eschatology. That breaks down into two real main categories of how we look at the Bible when we're looking at Bible prophecy. One of them is futurism. So futurism, and I'm going to kind of refer to these notes here, the interpretive framework that holds that most biblical prophecies that were future from the time of Christ, especially in passages like Matthew 24 and Revelation, and even in the book of Daniel, are still awaiting fulfillment in our future. Granted, all of the prophecies when written by the authors were future, but they're still future to us. And so that includes things like global events of final tribulation, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and the bodily return of Christ. So that's the first category that we would talk about in eschatology. And then it develops into preterism. Okay. You see, I have two different forms of preterism on here, and I'll kind of explain that. But preterism is a word that means past. So that's where we get that from, preter or praetor. It's an interpretive framework that believes that many, if not most, I won't say all, but most biblical prophecies, especially in places like we just talked about that were considered future in the futurist viewpoint, like Matthew 24, the book of Revelation, those were all fulfilled in the first century, particularly around the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Now, I'm going to pause right here because that is an event that is so downplayed inside our churches today. And that's a real frustrating thing for me. This event was probably the biggest event aside from the coming of Christ, his death, burial, and resurrection. This event is massive as we look at eschatology and the study of Bible prophecy. You see, this event of AD 70 is really involving the true end. While there was a real end to the old covenant through Jesus, there was a finishing of that covenant, a finality to it in AD 70. And what happened in AD 70? That's when you have the war of Rome in Jerusalem or Israel, where the temple is destroyed finally, once and for all. It's never been rebuilt. Now, this event is huge inside of the eschatological calendar. Okay, so the temple, this was the second temple. If you don't know that, there was a destruction of the temple before, and it was rebuilt. This was the rebuilt temple. Not only was it the rebuilt temple, but it was a refurbished temple because Herod had done a massive what's the word I'm looking for? Hey, Amber, help me with that word. Basically, he had revamped it and brought it to its probably its biggest glory or highest form of glory. So it was the center of the people of Israel, the chosen people of God. It was something that they relied upon heavily. And its destruction really was described and predicted in the Bible, especially in Matthew 24 and in Revelation, actually. And in that description, really hyperbolic and symbolic terms were used. And the reason being is because it was such a major event. So inside of preterism, preterists, in its proper term, not in the hyper as we're getting ready to discuss, but in the proper preterist term, they give the most balanced and biblical look at that actual event. And that's key. That's something that was really allowed me to appreciate and understand that. It's really giving credence to biblical prophecy and its fulfillment. You know, many people downplay it and think that preterists are missing some of the biggest prophecies that are about to happen. So futurists, for example, they are looking at events that are happening actually in our newspapers and in our actual geopolitical worlds and trying to see biblical prophecy in them. And the thing is there's a lot of things inside those prophecies that tell us that it's not talking about that. The major event in history that it's talking about is the destruction and the events leading up to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. So now there is a evil brother of preterism, if you will, called hyperpreterism. Hyperpreterism, or full preterism as it sometimes is called, I prefer hyper, holds that some of the core doctrines of the, holds that some of the core doctrines of the faith are not true. Because of their viewpoint of things being fulfilled, they extend it to certain things that we know and are promised will happen in the future. There's two main things that come out in this. One is the bodily return of Christ, the actual return of Christ, something that we see in the book of Acts and in Thessalonians, the actual return of Christ. Now, let's pause there. There was a coming of Christ in 70 AD. Now, people are going, well, what, right? That really throws people off. But we have to understand how the Old Testament actually uses that term coming. It's normatively, not bodily. Jesus coming, God coming as Jesus, was a special, very special eschatological event. Okay. So the normal comings don't happen that way. They're normally the coming on like terms like the clouds, where they come in judgment. And there are numerous verses in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, that talk about this. So when Jesus came in AD 70, he was coming to judge Israel. Let's let that sink in for a minute. Israel was God's wife. As a matter of fact, there's verses in the Old Testament that talk about her having actually committed harlotry towards God or Yahweh. And the punishment was divorce. And Jesus comes and says, oh, I wish I would be, gather you up, right? And he goes to the temple and he sees what it's become. And he basically turns and looks and gives the example through Mark with the fig tree and basically goes, you will not produce fruit ever again. So Jesus comes in AD 70 in the clouds, not in his physical form, and he puts an end to them. He actually executes them. The divorce has been decreed, and now he executes them and ends them. So but Paul tells us, this isn't some type of anti-Semitic thing. Paul tells them that they are more than welcome as people to come back in. They're the branches that have been broken off, and they can tie themselves or be tied back to the vine, which is Jesus. So that's one of the big parts. Hyperpreterism denies that coming of Christ, right? It only sees any prediction of a coming being handled in AD 70. But there are things that we see in the coming languages and certain passages that seem to be way further, way more cataclysmic than what we saw in AD 70. And we'll look at some of those. The second one is the bodily resurrection. They deny this ending of time where the body has an importance in its connection with the soul. So that's two things that are very considered very heretical inside of Orthodox Christianity, that hyperpreterism takes some of the principles of preterism and takes them to an extent where it loses its grounding in orthodoxy. So you've heard me mention this, the return of Christ. What am I talking about? If you're not familiar with that, the return of Christ, the bodily return of Christ, specifically what we're talking about. I think there are two passages, which there's a lot of controversy right now on what passages, how do we know when we're talking about a bodily return and a coming in judgment? These are two passages that I feel pretty confident in stating deal with this bodily return. Acts 1, chapter 1, 9 through 11. And after he had said these things, now remember this is after after Jesus has died, risen from the dead, and spent time with his followers. It says he was lifted up while they were looking on, and a cloud received him out of their sight. And as they were gazing intently into the sky, while he was going, behold, two men in white clothing stood beside them. They also said, Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking toward heaven? This Jesus, who has been taken up from you into heaven, right, will come in just the same way as you have watched him go into heaven. So this seems to tell us that there's some coming of Jesus that has something a little bit more bodily involved. So I don't tie that to the coming in judgment in the book of Revelation. I think this one has a strong tie to a physical return in the future, giving them a hope, right? The next one is 1 Thessalonians 4, 16 through 17. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive and remain will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so we shall always be with the Lord. So I've done some exegesis in this passage before, and I don't want to get caught up too much here. But I think this idea of being with the Lord, when you have the dead being raised, has to do with, again, that idea of something that I don't think we saw happen in AD 70. So those are two passages that I think give us an idea that not all eschatology is complete. Now, so we have futurism and preterism, two kind of ways of looking at Bible prophecy. Excuse me just one second there. these two ways get broken down even further, okay? Millennial systems. Okay, this is the thing you're going to hear a lot about. The first system, and again, I will start with the ideas that I don't think are align with how I see Bible prophecy. Premillennialism. What are we talking about? Where's this idea? What is a millennium? So a millennium inside of Bible prophecy comes from the book of Revelation. There it mentions a 1,000 years where Satan or the dragon or Satan, are bound and unable to deceive the nations. There is also a mention of a coming to life of martyrs who had been beheaded for Christ, coming to life and reigning with Christ during this time. Premillennialism, okay, so the millennium is 1,000-year reign, and premillennialism, pre meaning before, is the view that Christ will return before that millennium. Now, we've already talked about the return of Christ, right? The return of Christ, a bodily return of Christ, where he comes to earth, at least into a visible form, right? That event in history will happen before the millennium, according to premillennialism. That will usher in a reign where Christ will reign with the saints. And like I said, the devil will be bound, and it's said to be for 1,000 years. Now, I really struggle with anybody who tries to take 1,000 years literally, like it's literally a calendar that kicks off. It just doesn't, that doesn't flow with how scripture uses time, for one. And 1,000 often is used, the cattle on 1,000 hills. It's normally used to describe something of some form of perfection or completeness. It's normally not a literal idea of 1,000 years. Now, premillennialism breaks down into two camps. You have dispensationalism, okay? And you also have what they call historic premillennialism. We're going to start with dispensationalism. Now, I'm going to take a slight second here to get on a soapbox. Most of the content that's going to be coming out over the next month or even longer is truly to combat this view. I think this view truly borderlines on heresy. This view is dangerous, both can be dangerous spiritually. It can definitely be dangerous geopolitically. And it is something that I truly pray for the reformation of the evangelical church and fundamentalist church to get rid of this view. It really is that dangerous. So dispensationalism, to explain it, is a view that teaches that God has two distinct plans specifically for salvation. One is for Israel and one for the church. So if that doesn't already kind of make you go, well, that sounds right. That makes sense. They were under two different covenants and so forth. Let's follow along. They also believe in this, that many prophecies about Israel will be fulfilled in the future. Now that's the part where you should go, wait, that doesn't sound right. Often including a rapture of the church before a tribulation period. Now I haven't gotten to the tribulation period, but we got to go through this rapture thing first. First of all, this is very new inside of systematic theology or an eschatology within the last couple hundred years. Specifically going back to John Nelson Darby. The idea of a secret, or even if you want to consider it public, rapture of the church before Christ returns. Most people historically have thought that the rapture of the church is that Thessalonian passage, which is at the end. But there was a view, and it was really influenced. I was saying this, I didn't realize this, even though I knew a lot about the idea inside of dispensationalism and its system. But the rapture came from really stemmed from the idea of thinking of these two different plans of God, one being Israel, one being the church. The idea that there were still things that needed future fulfillment for the nation of Israel, specifically tied to the land. And in that, for that to be completed, God has to take the church out of the world. And he will do this in this event called the rapture. and God will take the church out of the world and then deal with Israel. And this is where you get the movies from Tim LaHaye, and you'll hear the books or read the books from Hal Lindsey and the sermons from John Hagee, which we plan on actually dealing with some of those very soon. But that's the idea. Okay. This is very problematic for the rest of systematic theology, the idea of these two separate entities. And it really goes against what God, or specifically through Paul, talks about with the two entities. But that's the idea. That's dispensationalism. That is the most recent form of eschatology inside of the systems that I'm describing. The next is the idea of the historic premill view. Again, I still don't hold to this view, but it has way stronger roots inside of church history. Historic premillennialism holds that Christ's return, again, we talked about that return, the actual physical bodily return, not the coming in judgment in AD 70. It will happen before the millennium, right? Same as dispensationalism, but does not separate Israel and the church into two distinct plans in the same manner. It typically sees the church going through a tribulation period before Christ returns, though. Okay. And now that's when we'll get into the tribulation idea. So when people talk about the tribulation, they're usually talking about a way of reading passages like Matthew 24, if you haven't read that, and also the events of the cataclysmic judgment and chaos that happens in Revelation. Those are the things that they're talking about when they're talking about the tribulation. Even John says in the book of Revelation, I'm a fellow, when he writes to the seven churches, he says, I'm a fellow, I don't know what the word is now, I've lost it, but he is a fellow traveler through this tribulation, or, one experiencing it in the same way as the churches he's writing to. So obviously this is a futurist system of millennium, and more specifically, premillennialism, where those chapters are describing a future period of intense suffering of people in judgment before, they're describing all that is before Christ's return. This is a period where an antichrist is ruling and causing terror through world domination. Now, I want to pause right here because there have been predictions and accusations of people being the antichrist and ushering in the tribulation for 2,000 years. Okay. The Pope, Napoleon, Hitler. If you watch the video that just got released today, there's people that think it's Donald Trump. It's funny to me to see that, not funny in a good way, but funny in an ironic way, because the more time goes on, the more they find a correlation to whoever they're trying to assign it to. But in reality, the closest is truly actually in the book of Revelation and actually happened in history. So the tribulation period, as I hold as a preterist, actually occurred during that time where leading up to the destruction of the temple. And we'll actually get into that a little bit later. But this is the idea of historic premillennialism. Now, we're actually going to take a break right now, and we're actually going to show you what we have coming up that ties into all of this. So we'll be right back. We've got some big conversations coming up, and you're going to want to be a part of them. April 9th, we have a John Hagee reaction video where we pressure test Pastor Hagee's eschatological timeline. On April 14th, Cloud and Fire will go live with a deep dive into the millennium. April 16th, reaction to critical scholar who claims there is no such thing as conservative scholarship. April 21, Cloud and Fire again, breaking down critical scholarships, which will be a follow-up to our 416 video. April 28th, part 2 of Hagee Reaction, where we get into the topic of Israel and who are the people of God. Make sure you're subscribed and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming up. Now back to the show. All right, sorry about that little bit delay there. The mouse got kind of goofy. So yeah, make sure that you check out those episodes. There's going to be a lot of information out there. Back to our millennial system. So we talked about premillennialism. We talked about its two different branches, a historic version and then also the dispensational version. There's another view. The next two are really, the longer I study this, the more I see their similarities. The more I feel sympathetic towards both, even though I do hold one and I won't hold my cards tight. I will tell you by the end. But the next one in the system is called amillennialism. This is a view that the millennium, right, the 1,000 years described in Revelation 20, is not a future literal 1,000-year earthly reign, but is actually a present spiritual reign of Christ from heaven during the current age. So it spiritualizes the reign of Christ described in Revelation 20. And you may be going, well, I'm a literalist. Okay, the bottom line is that we need to interpret the scriptures as they are intended. I want to interpret the Bible when it's being literal as being literal. I don't want to interpret the Bible when it's not being literal as being literal. I don't think that any of the historic views, especially specifically in amillennialism and in postmillennialism, ever have the idea that it's a literal 1,000-year reign. And I don't think it makes sense to try to force that in there based on the texts around it. And we'll get into that a little bit in future videos. But amillennialism, I think, has the right idea in that this is a current state. Now, the difference between them and the next view really is in what the millennial reign looks like, what it is in substance. And so I'm very sympathetic to them. I'm just a little bit more optimistic, and I'll explain what that means. So they would point to the passages that say Jesus is seated at the right hand of the Father now. You know, one of the most quoted verses of the Old Testament in the New Testament is Psalm 110. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies thy footstool. That is quoted all over the New Testament. It is the most quoted, like I said, and it describes Jesus. And so we have Stephen, as he's being stoned, looking up into heaven and seeing Jesus at the right hand of God. We see him already in Acts, in the Acts passage where he's ascending into heaven. Jesus actually says that I have bound the strong man, being Satan, because I am here doing these deeds such as exorcisms. So there's a strong case to be made, and because they see those passages, they're trying to interpret what this reign is, and that's what they come up with. That this is a spiritual reign, and it does make sense. So when they come to Revelation 20, they read the 1,000 years symbolically, not as a future earthly kingdom, but as a picture of Christ's current reign during the church age. There's a strong tie. We live in the church age now, right? And they tie that reign to being Christ's reign. The next millennial system we'll talk about is postmillennialism. That is the view that I hold. Although, if you caught last week's episode, I kind of explained, I think I'm more of a pessimistic postmillennialist than some are. And if you didn't watch that episode, you should check it out. Postmillennialism, like all millennialism, believes the bodily return of Christ will occur after the millennial period. So again, premillennialism believes that Christ's bodily return happens before this reign. Postmillennialism, amillennialism, believes that it's after. Where they differ is in the nature of the millennium. Amillennialism sees it as the present church age, and there's a mix of good and evil. Christ is reigning, but it's not necessarily the idea that everyone has been perfected and is good, and that there's no evil. They look at more like the wheat and the tares still existing side by side. They don't have a view, and this is where they're often known as like, millennial, because they don't really have a view of much being conquered in the same robust way as even the premillennialist does, which it's almost a perfected world. Sorry to go on a soapbox here, but it's a bizarre idea. You actually, and in dispensational premillennialism, you have like dead people being raised, walking with other people and living weird lengths of time, and it gets very clunky. Postmillennialism, though, sees Christ reigning now, like all millennialism, but expects the gospel to increase and transform the world over time. That's very hard for people to understand right now. There are people that propose the view that we're actually very early on in the church. And to be honest with you, I'm going to get flack for this, but the fact that dispensationalism exists is proof to me that we are still early on. We need to grow up in our eschatology. We need to go way further than that. The reign of Christ is now. If you look at a religion that started with 12 disciples of one man and has grown to be as impactful as it is today, it is growing. And I think we have a long way to go from here. I don't think the decline will be the end. I do think that when Jesus comes back, it will be a more robust world that Jesus comes back to than the one that we see it seems to be going towards now. The people that struggle to see that are the ones that just struggle to understand the power of the gospel. I do believe that the gospel will win the day, and that's what we have to hope for. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to happen within my lifetime. It doesn't mean that it's going to happen in my child's lifetime. It also doesn't mean that I am the overly optimistic postmillennialist that thinks that it's going to look perfect. But I do think we will see periods of great peace. And that's where we can get terms like people taking their swords and their spears and plowing them in, or molding them into plowshares. So, but like I said, so I think there's some balance there but between the all and the post. But I do lean towards the postmillennialist. I do think that there will be a transformation of the culture that we are currently working towards, even when it doesn't necessarily look as clean as what we would like. The next thing, and we've kind of alluded to it, but we're going to go back to it, Israel and the church. This is where, so I've kind of given you this frame, right? Or this grid. In my opinion, it starts it on the wrong side. Dispensational premillennialism. We work to historic premillennialism. We work to all millennialism. And we work to postmillennialism. We work from futurist to preterist. The issue that I brought up earlier was about Israel and the church, and inside dispensationalism, their dangerous views of categorizing them the way that they do. A key question underneath eschatology is, what is the relationship between Israel and the church? Right now, we're seeing it play out in geopolitical format. Do we have an obligation to defend Israel as God's people? Some views inside dispensationalism, they actually think that Israel and the church are two distinct groups, that promises to Israel are future and national in fulfillment. And this is the issue, because they actually think that the United States or any nation should be involved in contributing to their well-being. They go back to Genesis 12 and the promise to Abraham, where he says, I'm going to make a nation of you, and whoever blesses you, I will bless, and whoever curses you, I will curse. But there's another view of that. And actually, I think maybe we need to actually look at this. It's going to be somewhat off the cuff here, guys, so just bear with me a second. But I don't think we can go through this teaching without talking about Romans 11. I can't believe that actually worked. So it says, yeah, I still get the ads, right? Okay. Romans 11, verse 17. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, although a wild olive shoot, were grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree. Now, if you're going, where am I at here? Let's break this down. The branches that were broken off were Israel. They rejected the Messiah. They cried out during Christ's trial that the blood be upon them and their children. Because they did that, the wild olive shoots were grafted in. Those were being the Gentiles. So Paul warns and says, do not be arrogant toward the branches. If you are, remember, it is not you who support the root, but the root that supports you. Now, I would actually argue that the root is not Israel. They're still the branches that broke off. The root is Christ. And I could go to Galatians and talk about that, where it says literally that the promise was to Abraham's seed, not to Abraham. And it wasn't to seeds, multiple, it was to seed. And Paul says that is Christ. It says, then you will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. That is true. They were broken off because of their unbelief, but you stand fast through faith. So do not become proud, but fear, for if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. Note then the kindness and the severity of God. Severity toward those who have fallen, but God's kindness to you, provided you continue in his kindness, otherwise you will be cut off. And even they, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in. For God has the power to graft them in again. For if you were cut off, for if you were cut from what is by nature a wild olive tree and grafted, contrary to nature, into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these, the natural branches, be grafted back in to their own olive tree? And there's one last thing that we have to see to understand this. Paul, anticipating the question of this idea that not all Israel will be saved, says, but is it not as though the word of God has failed? For not all who are descended from Israel belong to Israel. And not all are children of Abraham because they are of offspring, because they are his offspring. The concept is still faith and is always faith. Even we saw that in chapter 11. So the idea is that you have one root, which is Christ, and you have natural branches. And when it says natural branches, we think, well, that must be some higher elevated way. Paul doesn't want to downplay what Israel had. But ultimately, they are broken off and burned if they do not have faith. The nation of Israel has a faith right now that denies the Messiah, and they deny the Christ. They deny what Paul has said. Therefore, religiously, theologically, they are not God's people. God has divorced those who reject the Messiah. As a nation, like any other treaty or ally that we would have, that's how we should treat them. There is no responsibility of a nation who is Christian to protect them in any other way than through normal treaties and through normal relationship. God's chosen people make up this olive tree that's been discussed in Romans 11. And that's who we should be looking towards protecting. So let's go back to our PowerPoint. I guess that's what means we're done with that PowerPoint. So, Amber, do we have any questions or anything in the comment? Okay, very good. So we are just about out of time. Let me switch screens here. So in closing, I just want to say that these are the frameworks that we're going to be dealing with as we talk about a lot of the things going forward. We're trying to look and see when we hear these terms, we want to be able to recognize them quicker. And when we hear someone talk, we want to be able to categorize that in a little better way so that we know what we're actually dealing with. So we have one last thing to go over today. And just briefly on the history of eschatology, because this matters more than most people realize. Throughout church history, there have always been different and sometimes extreme views about the end times. But when you have looked at the ways Christians have read prophecy, they have tended to look more like historic premillennialism and especially amillennialism. What most people today are familiar with, especially ideas tied to modern Israel, the rapture, and detailed end times timelines, well, they're actually more recent developments. They really only took shape in the last couple hundred years. Now, that doesn't automatically make them wrong, but it should at least make us slow down and ask where these ideas are coming from. And we need to realize how much they're shaping the way we read Scripture, and even how we think about current events. Some of these views don't just stay theological or hypothetical. They spill over into how people think politically, especially when it comes to Israel. We need to realize and accept there's been a long tradition of seeing Christ as reigning now, especially in views like amillennialism and postmillennialism. So just because a particular framework has become common in modern evangelicalism, that doesn't mean it should go unexamined. This is an area where we need to be willing to slow down, test our assumptions, and if necessary, we need to be willing to reform. So, until next time, stay shaped by reason, guided by faith, and grounded in Christ. Take it easy.